Thank you. Well, week 3, educating for politics. What is politics? What we're trying to look at this evening. And many people will say, I suppose, that they're not interested in politics. And one response made to that has been, well, you're not interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. I suppose politics reaches into every dimension of our lives. Politics shape, impact our health, our well-being, education, the environment in which we live, work, income, the quality of our lives. Politics is about how our lives together are organized, managed, and resourced. We may have no interest in politics. We may even hate politics, but politics is interested in us, and it seems that there is no life together without politics. It may also be true that everything is politics, but politics is not everything. There are values. Values are indispensable to life in community and life together, and politics without values may turn out to be brutal and oppressive, lacking any sense of a common good, and unbearable. Politics we've always had with us, at least ever since humankind began to form communities and realized that to survive, they needed to organize, create systems of power, management of resources, an economy, a way of living together, and rules for getting along with each other. Humankind needed politics, and the Greeks invented politics, or they gave us a language, and we still use that language. So what about this political speak? It was some 2,500 years ago that the Greeks invented political speak to describe their political arrangements. And the words that we have borrowed and translated into English are politics, democracy, aristocracy, tyranny, and we have identified with their political ideals, freedom, independence, and self-government. Words represent ideas, and we have a rich Greek glossary. Key words, for example, are civitas, a political unit which we call state, crucially important for political activity. We have already met demokratai, meaning the power of the people, oligarchai, which is the rule of the few, a system in which a few wealthy citizens rule. The Greeks gave us the word tyrannos, an absolute ruler who rules without any concern for the law and any common good. And perhaps the key word created by the Greeks was polis. In Athens, that was the city-state and was the most significant unit of political activity. That was where politics really worked. They had a related word, politia, citizenship, the political community and its form of government and form of rule. Where polis started, we're not quite sure, but the Greeks had something up and running by 600 BCE. And it lasted for a little over 2 centuries until the middle of the 4th century, when Philip of Macedonia and his more famous son, Alexander the Great, especially the latter, brought the democratic polis and Athenian politics to an end. Perhaps empires don't do democratic politics. The Greek polis may have been created for military reasons. It's said a scattered group of people came to live in one city behind a set of protective walls. But there may have been another reason, a political reason. A group of people agreed to live under one authority with or without the protection of a walled city. So a group agreed to live under one authority meant an arrangement of power, management of power, rules or laws and decisions about community life together and well-being. Politics was born. Later, Aristotle, one of the great Greek thinkers and philosophers, said that the polis was natural. It existed by nature. It's how we're meant to live the good life in common. Now, Aristotle was big on ethics, writing a big book on ethics. And the ethical The ethical Aristotle insisted that the polis must be built on justice. Justice is not the one and only virtue, but one virtue among many, but justice is key to the polis. And justice has something to do with the distribution of authority and power according to political virtue. He believed, said, a just state must have just inhabitants. States are only just if their citizens live just lives. So politics is how we agree to organize our lives together, and our politics, if politics is to work, must be built on justice. There is no life, it seems, outside politics. It's core to life together, and the justice upon which any state is to be built is only just if its citizens live just lives. So politics is not only interested in us, we are politics, the polis, which doesn't work without our ethical engagement, our commitment to living just lives. Greek political speak is the political reality in which we live. We look at political populism. Politics, of course, becomes distorted, even corrupted. Power becomes corrupt and justice is ignored or denied. We all lived through 2016, a watershed year. Two major political events in 2016 are still warping the polis. The presidential election in the United States brought to power Donald Trump. Someone on the far right was now in power in the most powerful nation on earth. Of course, political populism existed also in Europe and was rising. And populism was now at its highest level since the 1930s, when Hitler and National Socialism came to power. The second political event in 2016 was Brexit. And both the presidential election and Brexit were bitter campaigns, and they were divisive. Politics became toxic, and the deep rifts opened up in the US and the UK have not healed, but are still very much part of the politics. And lest we forget, in 2018, there were riots in Belgium. I was caught up in them in Brussels, in the Netherlands and Germany, Austria, Sweden, Hungary, and Albania. People had lost trust in politicians and governments, and trust was at an all-time low. It was said that in Britain at the beginning of 2016, only 36% of the British public expressed trust in the government. By the start of 2017, this had fallen further to 26%. Global research among younger people suggests a loss of faith in democracy, a diminishing regard for human rights and for free elections. A minority only, it seems, are interested in politics. Well, perhaps we are at a danger point. With toxic politics and or a serious loss of interest in democracy and politics, we are close to tyranny. We are more than susceptible to populist politics. And this is why we have the strong men of politics. Trump, who may reappear, Putin, Orban, Erdogan, Modi, not to forget the coup in the British Conservative Party, now ruled by right-wing ideologues. Populism can come out of grievances, distress, injustice, humiliation, a real sense of being left behind. But populist politics, as well as being toxic and divisive and blaming an elite for the injustice and the corruption and appealing to the worst angels of our nature, is based not only on nostalgia very often, but fantasy. Populist politics and strong men promise a return to greatness. But it is fantasy, often leads to tyranny, new forms of fascism and totalitarianism. Populist politics offers simplistic solutions to complex problems. The Greeks were aware of it over 2,000 years ago. Plato said that democracy would always degenerate into tyranny. Plato, I suppose, knew because his teacher Socrates was put to death by democracy for corrupting young people by teaching them to ask critical questions. So we learn a lot from the Greeks about democracy and politics and about how both can be destroyed, but also why we need as citizens to be critical questioners and critically alive to the destruction of the foundation of politics, justice. Jonathan Sacks, the late chief rabbi, had this in mind when he wrote in one of his last books, remove the moral matrix of civil society and eventually you get populist politics and the death of freedom in the name of freedom. Before we go into groups, a quick look at the state and politics. We need to be aware of that relationship between state and politics. Aristotle, again, described the human being as by nature a political animal. We are born political, always interacting with others and communities. And so politics is the polis, or civil community, ordering its life together on the basis of a public good. To be human is to be political. There is power involved in our interactions with each other in community, and power always needs to be arranged and checked and managed. The state and the polis was the city-state in Athens. The state is the location of the supreme power within a society. Now, without getting into the distinction between a state and a nation and their complex history, we all live in a state, though whether Northern Ireland is a state or not is contested. But the state has been described as society acting as a whole, while the ultimate power, with the ultimate power to compel compliance within its own jurisdiction. Now, this does not mean that when the state acts, everybody within society agrees. There is no absolutely unanimous society anywhere in the world. Political conflict is normal. And when a state does act, it is with resources from within the society as a whole. But dissent is a healthy part of a society and its power relations. And here I suppose we need to be critically aware of the myth or the fiction of sovereignty. With Brexit, we got taking back control, especially at borders. Making America great again was about taking back power as sovereignty, and especially white sovereignty. This is delusional, rooted in nostalgia and pure fiction. We live in a world where power and independence have been limited even for the most powerful states in the world. No state totally, it has been said, controls its own destiny. No power exists altogether unchecked by other external powers. The state may be society acting as a whole, but there is no absolute sovereignty in an interdependent world unless a state deludes itself into thinking that it can go alone and exercise absolute power in the world. That is a domination system, an imperium, and a grave threat to peace and a common good. Society itself is the sovereign source of political power, not the state. They didn't quite get it right in the Athenian polis or at the founding of the United States, but the big idea was there. Sovereignty lies with we the people. And when the Athenians came up with cosmopolites, citizen of the world, and that the truly significant political community is the world community, sovereignty is shared, pooled, if you like, and never an absolute for any state. So a question is, how do we organize, manage, check, even share power? Power sharing was not an exceptional part of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. It's a normal part of the polis, politics. But maybe we need to get our heads around that locally and globally. Okay, we can go into those rooms. Fionnuala will allocate us accordingly. There are two questions. If we remove the moral, it's a quote from Jonathan Sachs, if we remove the moral matrix of civil society, what kind of politics are we likely to have? And then one that is close to home, why is the sharing of power an important part of democratic politics? Do we have this in Northern Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, and in the UK? Well, politics matters. It may frustrate many of us, and I think we've been expressing frustrations. And for some time now across Europe, people are skeptical, increasingly skeptical about politics. This lack of trust or lack of confidence in politicians and the political processes. And we have particular frustrations in Northern Ireland. I detect you have particular frustrations in the Republic as well. But for half of the last 6 or 7 years, we have not had a functioning assembly or executive. So rather than politics with a foundation in justice, as Aristotle talked about, we have politics with a foundation in sectarianism, which itself is an injustice. But then we remind ourselves that, as we do sometimes, that we get the politicians we vote for, we get the politicians we deserve. Maybe perhaps it's too easy to blame politicians and to brand politicians as a failure. Power lies with we the people, not the political party or an elite group of politicians. In that sense, we all have political responsibility, which is why we need an active civic society. Now, the challenge and the failure of politics is perhaps to enhance understanding and education and communication in relation to democracy and politics. Maybe we are passive consumers of politics who need to be empowered to become active citizens. And in education and understanding, I think there is empowerment. In education and democracy matters and in politics, there will be the realization that politics is not a spectator sport, not sitting on the sidelines or playing from the ditch. Now, if you've ever stood in the terracing or sat in a stand at a sporting event, you will have heard, I'm sure, many around you, perhaps including yourself, who can play the game better than the late Pele from Brazil. The experts in the stand are not in the field, but it doesn't stop them from being experts. Politics is not like that, or it's not meant to be like that. It's not a spectator sport. It requires active citizens and participants. Now, this does not mean that everyone should join a political party. For some it might, but it does mean active engagement with political matters, which are bread and butter and the practice of active participatory and deliberative democracy, what the Australians called kitchen table politics or discussions. We sometimes say that politics is a dirty business, and sometimes it is. It seems that way, especially when corruption is evident and in the corruption of power. But we also, I suppose, need realism in our politics. Beyond the corruption of power and practice, there is the messiness about politics. Someone put it this way: democratic politics is messy, cumbersome, and at times frustrating, because life and the world are themselves generally messy, cumbersome, and at times frustrating. There are no simple solutions to the challenges we face. Well, we do live in a messy world. Why should politics be any less messy? And perhaps we should acknowledge the same with religion and the humanistic and the secular, generally messy, cumbersome, and at times frustrating. All of it because that is the world we live in. Politics matter, though. May be imperfect. Politics matter despite all the imperfections. Political theorist Matthew Flinders suggests that politics matters because it will not tolerate persecution or torment or oppression. Sometimes it does tolerate and practice persecution and torment or oppression on citizens, but generally democratic politics will not allow such a development. Those who might want that kind of society can be blocked or deprived of the oxygen by active democratic politics. So politics matters because essential to it is compromise. A crucial foundation stone of democratic politics is compromise. Compromise has often been a dirty word in Northern Ireland. Compromise has been identified with sellout, with betrayal, being labelled in some circles as a Lundy after the general at the siege of Derry in 1689, who apparently wanted to open the gates and negotiate with the enemy. His effigy is still burned every December in Derry, London Derry. Well, leaving aside the contested issue of fact or fiction, history or myth about Lundy, compromise is foundational to good working politics. If politics is the art of the possible, then very often nothing is possible without compromise. Red lines can become the negation of politics. And this is the problem with fundamentalism in all its expressions. Been put this way, fundamentalism, be it religious, environmental, economic, biological, or cultural, is therefore incompatible with any form of democratic politics, simply due to the fact that it represents a refusal of dialogue in a world where peace depends on it. So no politics without dialogue, no politics without compromise. The basis, therefore, of democratic politics is the acceptance of difference. Difference or diversity is constitutive of human and ecological existence. If we want to put it in theological terms, God has built difference into the very constitution of the universe. Difference is a fundamental reality of life. And politics is based on the acceptance of difference and therefore compromise and a commitment to conciliation or reconciliation. Of course, politics is full of tensions and at times stalemate and gridlock and lots of frustrations. But at the foundation of all politics is difference and compromise and reconciliation. Politics then is civilizing, or it ought to be. And this is why we are right as citizens, active members of civic society, to insist that our politics is civil and our politicians conduct themselves with civility, and that civility be the mark of our public discourse. It has been said that politics then is a way of ruling divided societies without undue violence. Well, all societies hold a variety of different interests, different political aspirations, different moral perspectives. There is no uniformity of anything. And the only way to have uniformity and homogeneity is to impose it and enforce it. Well, that has happened. And when it does, it often ends up with violence, oppression, the denial of rights. When politicians refuse or withdraw from governance and legislation in a divided society, they create a vacuum that can, and sometimes and often does, open the door to violence. So from an ethical perspective, compromise, conciliation and reconciliation is better than coercion or imposed cultural, social and political homogeneity. Politics is the art of living with differences, thorny and difficult differences, the art of rubbing along together, of negotiation, dialogue, pursuing a common good in our communities, at our kitchen tables, and in our assemblies and houses of parliament. Politics matter and is the responsibility of all of us. Finally, to say something about what we'll call covenantal politics. There is, of course, as you know, a history of covenant in the history and politics of the northeast of Ireland. For some, the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant of 1912 is the foundational document of Northern Ireland. It was a religio-political document with a basis in earlier Scottish covenants. It was also believed to have a basis in the biblical covenant and in the Reformed theological tradition. Whatever is made of it, and however iconic the Ulster Covenant is for some, Covenantal politics is very different and much more radical and foundational. It is even more radical than when Abraham Lincoln spoke of the United States as a nation formed by a covenant. The truth in Lincoln's assertion was that he was driven by the important idea that the US was or was intended to be a moral community. Lincoln was driven by moral and ethical conviction, which was inspired by the Judeo-Christian ethic. He was drawing on the ancient Hebrew-Jewish social ethical vision of community, which had also been embraced by the later Christian tradition rooted in Hebrew-Jewish imagination. And that big idea was covenant, and it was a socio-political idea. And something we have forgotten about this radical biblical covenant is that it was essentially an economic vision. The Jewish covenant was inseparably social, political, and economic. But there was something even more radical than Lincoln and Thomas Sinclair, the author of the Ulster Covenant, didn't quite get. The vision in both of those covenants was limited to Protestants, and in the American case, white Protestants. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has a greater grasp of the Jewish vision of covenant, but then you might say he's Jewish. And he says this: covenant is what we have in common, despite our differences. It speaks to us as active citizens sharing collective responsibility. It is not the politics of us against them. It is the politics of all of us together. So there is a radical inclusivity about covenantal politics. Everybody is in. No us and them. Sacks again, a covenantal politics would speak of how, as a polity, an economy, and culture, our fates are bound together. We benefit from each other. A covenantal politics would emphasize our responsibilities to one another. Well, another word for covenant is neighborliness. And neighborliness is inclusive, and no one is left out. There is no us and them, no class, religion, ethnic, social, cultural, or race exclusion. Society has built itself on contract. Covenant is not contractual, but relational. It is neighborly, radically, inclusively neighborly. Sacks again, a covenant creates a moral community. It binds people together in a bond of mutual responsibility and care. Now, what difference would it make to our politics if we had covenantal politics? Radically inclusive, neighborly, caring politics. And Jonathan Sacks sees something else in covenantal politics. I quote, "The politics of covenant does not demean or ridicule opponents. It honors the process of reasoning together. It gives special concern to those who most need help, and special honor to those who most give help." So politics matters, and covenantal politics matters a great deal. It can be transformative. Perhaps on this island and elsewhere, we need, whether we use this language or not, we need a new covenant, a new kind of inclusive, neighborly politics that really matters and brings us closer to a common good. Okay, we've about 10 minutes or so. You might want to talk about what it would mean to have covenantal politics. is there something in the cultural tradition, the Judeo tradition, which, by the way, is also in the Islamic tradition, that we have missed in our approach to politics?